more that you do any behavior, the more those neural pathways cement. So it becomes a coping mechanism, a habit loop. So the next phase of my research now is to try to understand whether psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, whether they may be able to reduce some of this hyperactivation to these cues, and whether it can increase an individual's ability to be able to receive and feel pleasure from natural rewards.
Hi everybody, welcome back to This is Powerful with me, Paul Scolford. In this podcast, I speak to some incredible people about mindset, mental health, addiction and recovery. And I share my own journey throughout these conversations. So whether you're on your own path of self-discovery, recovery or transformation, inspired by human stories of mental resilience, or supporting someone who is struggling with addiction, make sure you follow and subscribe to This is Powerful. There'll be a new episode every Thursday. In these episodes, we will be talking about drug and alcohol misuse, suicide, sexual abuse, and some other heavy topics. So please take care when listening. Today I have an incredible guest called Dr. Rayann Zafar. He's really open about he had food issues when he was younger, which propelled him into wanting to know about how the brain works. Rayyan talks about the reward pathways being hijacked by addiction, and he talks about, which I was really interested in, are you born with addiction? Is there a genetic predisposition? What we also discussed, which I didn't think we would do with a scientist, is about the spiritual element of addiction. Dr. Zafar and I talk about the clinical trials he's doing on psilocybin, how effective that actually really is with alcoholism, addiction and depression. So please join us. Hey Rayann, lovely to see you. Thank you for being on This is Powerful.
Thank you for having me.
How would you introduce yourself?
I'm a neuropsychopharmacologist. It's a big word, but I study the effects of drugs in the mind and the brain. And I particularly look at how certain drugs can be used and therapies to help people with addictions. So I spent the last 6 years as a neuroscientist trying to unravel some brain mechanisms in addiction and trying to develop new treatments for people who are living with addiction too.
And you're the first person to have a PhD in psychedelics in the UK, right?
I was the first person to be funded by the government for this work, specifically in addiction and psychedelics and the impact that has. So, yeah, the government really kind of, with me and my boss, Professor David Nutt, who has been a guest on the show, Dr. David Ritz, so we actually received the first government funding to do this work.
Would you tell us who you are and where you're from?
Yeah, sure.
and how did you get into, and basically how did you get into this? It's such a niche area you're in, and you're so highly qualified, so you must have a super passion for it. So how you got into that as well?
So I was born in Manchester. I come from like a family that were born in India and Pakistan, quite working class family, and they've always tried to work hard. And I guess somewhat coming from those backgrounds, when you move to the UK, your parents and your grandparents have aspirations for you to be a doctor or for you to make the most of your life. So that was always semi-drilled into me from a young age to, make the most of what being a British citizen could have. But it wasn't until I was 11 that I really started thinking about the mind and the brain. And that was due to me actually developing a mental health condition called anorexia nervosa. So it's like an eating disorder. So I went to this new school from my primary school, and it was an all-boys school. I struggled to fit in a bit and find my space. And so then I started thinking, maybe I should exercise, restrict my diet, maybe look a bit better. And that turned into a bit of an obsession, almost basically an addiction, I'd say. Like addicted to weight loss, addicted to the idea of this like perfect idea I had for me. And it spiraled quite badly, and I had to get taken into an inpatient ward and had psychiatrists. I got taken out of school for a year. And it was in those years between like 11 and 13, going through it and then recovering, that I realized a lot about my mind and about my brain, and like the discord between what I knew was good for me and what my brain was my mind were telling me to do. And I was like, there must be some brain basis to what's going on. So that sparked my curiosity in psychiatry and mental health. Then as I got a bit older, my current boss, Professor David Nutt, came to my school when I was 16, this was in like 2012, and showed the first brain imaging scans of LSD on the brain.
Wow.
And I was shocked. I didn't know anything about brain imaging, didn't know what that was. I knew what LSD was. I was growing up in Manchester, and it was the start of the new age rave scene with Warehouse Project. And I'd participated a few times. So I knew about drugs, I knew about the brain, I knew about mind. And here was this professor telling us that these drugs can change our consciousness and be potentially impactful for mental health. So I thought, right, I want to try and make decisions in my career to work with this person. And so I went to uni, did biomedical science, then did like specialisms in neuropsychiatry, trying to understand the neurological basis of psychiatric disorders. And then I applied for this government fellowships to study addiction and psychedelics with David Nutt in 2019 from the Medical Research Council. And that essentially was lucky. I got rejected twice, and then I was like, I'm not giving up on this. I really care about
Good
it.
bit of determination.
Yeah. And then the third time was obviously lucky enough to get it. And then I guess from there, I've developed like my research over the last 6 years, and addiction has really been like the core focus. So I think it's my personal, I always say I feel like I'm here because when I was younger, I didn't know what I was going through. And I want to try and help people make sense of their own mental health conditions and try to develop new treatments, because we're not very good at treating addiction or mental health treatments at all, really.
No, it's true. It's really inspiring now. And, clearly you are enthusiastic about it to see, because at such a young age, it must be so confusing. And a lot of people that go through things like that end up in a bad way.
Yeah.
So there's something about you that's gone into science that most people wouldn't have done. It'd been easy probably to run away from it. So that's quite impressive. What actually is addiction in your view?
Yeah, there's a medical definition, which is basically around compulsive drug use with the inability to stop, despite having negative personal consequences, social consequences, familial consequences, and job-related consequences. So I think really the definition should be broader. I think an addiction is any behavior, not just any kind of drug use or substance use, any behavior that is repetitive, that gives you a level of dependency, and that you'll do complicitly and compulsively, and you aren't able to manage despite negative consequences. So I'd broaden the definition out to any behavior. And the reason why I speak more about behaviors now is because I'm becoming more aware that substance addiction, which is predominantly looked at substances, there's a whole class of other addictions, behavioral addictions, which are becoming more rife and more prevalent. And I think they should also be more included in the broader definition.
And what are those behaviours?
So one of the first medically recognised behavioural addictions in 2013 was gambling addiction, which is an area that I've done some research in. But now a lot of doctors, scientists, regulators are looking at internet addiction, social media addiction, porn addiction, binge eating disorder, which can be classified as an addiction, and internet gaming, social media. These things are now being considered to be put into the same category as some of the substance use or some of the other behavioural addictions.
It's interesting because I came through a 12-step program.
Yeah.
Amongst trying out loads of other things for spirituality and stuff we spoke about before. And the common conversation is that you put down your primary addiction, whether it be gambling or sex addiction or whatever it is, and then a behavioural addiction usually comes up, or a secondary addiction comes up. So that's interesting to see what the science would be about it, because that's been like a general conversation in that little ecosystem for a while.
Yeah.
And I think you speak to any addict and that's that's firmly in recovery
Yeah.
will tell you that they have incredible self-knowledge and self-awareness about their behavior, like the first thought of like going to do something and then realizing, oh, I'm actually trying to change the way I feel. So what's going on? Let me look at that first before I make that decision.
Right,
But that's
yeah,
someone who's healthy and really in their recovery.
Yeah, it's interesting. So really our whole behavior systems, everything that we go out and choose to do is based around this one pathway in the brain. It's called the reward pathway. Every single one of us has it. And I think that's the reason why each one of us is vulnerable to developing addictions. Those pathways govern every behavior, and it's that pathway that really gets hijacked in addiction. So you say that, as you said, in those groups where you might give up one addiction but then take up another, it's because that pathway is the one that's yearning for more. It's like that dopamine pathway in the brain that needs replacement. A lot of the stuff I've spoke to former addicts about is about, instead of giving something up, they have to take something up in order to replace that activity. I see a lot of patients of ours going to like extreme sports, or like they get really obsessed with gardening, or like different things like that. And it's like, it's redirecting that behavior to something which is healthier than a substance.
There's a lot of people I know who do, I can't run anymore because I have an injury, but I think that would have been my thing, like
Running.
20 miles a day probably.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a craze now, running, and I think it's great, but then there's exercise addiction as well, which is
100%.
real. And I know people, and I know people struggling with that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of our behaviors that we do, and specifically in addiction, is really about finding a way to cope. It's about using an external behavior or substance to feel internally satisfied. And one really famous quote, I'm sure you know, is Gabor Mate asks, "Don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain."
Yeah.
And almost all of these behaviors are really individuals trying to self-comfort something deeper, psychologically driven, that is causing them this unsettling feeling. And ultimately drugs are very good at dampening that feeling down.
And they're fast acting as well, aren't they?
Yeah, if you have something that you've not dealt with, early life trauma, childhood adversity, it can be a plethora of things, those substances numb that emotional response. And exercise as well, it can blunt that emotional response. You're taken out of it. These things become coping mechanisms over time.
I'm convinced that there's a genetic part to addiction, because, and also in the 12-step community we talk about it. Some people say they feel like they was born with it, and they feel like they was born with a couple of layers of skin less. They're more sensitive to situations, and the reactions are different from other people. And others are like, nope, I totally drank myself into addiction, or I totally used myself into addiction. Is there a genetic part?
The simple answer is yes. The complex answer is that it's more than just genetics. So really fascinating study was done at the end of last year, University of Michigan, and they looked at 200,000 people and they measured their genes. And you can do this thing where you look at all of the different genes in someone's genome. So a gene is something that will describe what color eye you have. But in this case, they were looking at genes that might be related to addiction. And what they found is that there were 19 different genetic mutations that were significantly associated with an increased likelihood of having an addiction.
Wow.
So it's not one gene. So certain neurological conditions like Huntington's, you have one gene deficit and you definitely get the syndrome. Whereas with addiction, it's a bit more complex. About 40 to 60% of the explanation for the disorder is genetic. And that can be due to one of these or several of these 19 different genes that an individual has. And those genes code for different things in the dopamine reward pathway. So the pathway is related to reward seeking or brain development. So that's one thing that we know, that there is this genetic heritability that you see. But beyond that, another really, really cool piece of research that was done is in this study called the ABCD study, and it tracks children's brains over time. 10,000 children, their brains are scanned at between 9 and 11 years old before they've even had a substance, and they scanned them again at 15. And what they did was they separated the kids into two camps, those that had tried a drug by 15 and those that hadn't. And they found that at 9 years old, 9 to 11, you could predict which kids, based on the front part of their brain, the frontal cortex, the thinner the frontal cortex, the higher the likelihood they were to use drugs before the age of 15. So that shows in some people, they have this abnormality in brain structure that predisposes them to want to take drugs.
Wow, that's fascinating. And is that why would that be thinner on the front cortex?
Your frontal cortex is involved primarily with executive functioning. Why am I doing something? It's also the part of the brain that basically says like, shh, like stop. And if you have a thinner frontal cortex, that part of your tissue is less able to say stop. Maybe a question for you. When you first used your first drug, how did you feel or drink?
We was at a friend's house and someone had cocaine. I was probably, I think 17. Yeah, 17, so I was driving. But so I just used a bit to belong. Didn't think much of it, but someone had put an acid in my drink prior to that.
As in LSD?
Yeah.
Okay.
Really strong purple.
Right.
And didn't tell anyone. And I heard someone say, oh, we got some acid. And I put my drink down the sink just in case they did it. But they'd done it to the drink before that.
Oh, right. Okay.
So it was a really crazy evening because I basically ended up tripping for 8 hours.
Okay.
First in a good way, then in a really bad way. So it was probably not the best example. But after that, when I did, I'd say cocaine I felt that instantly that I had no anxiety, no pain. I had no fear thought process.
Yeah.
It went almost to heroic. And I just felt like, wow.
Yeah.
What is this?
It's like I'm the bee's knees.
Basically, yeah, in all areas. It just took away instantly. And by the way, after years of using it, it makes you obviously paranoid, fearful, and everything that I wanted to leave came back tenfold. So just wanted to make that on the record. But yeah, it made me feel like heroic, like I can do anything, I can achieve anything, like I got the best thought process, I can do, plan anything I want to do. That's what happened.
Yeah. And then did you feel like you couldn't stop when you first had that first line? Did you feel like you wanted more? And I mean, I guess you did because
so there wasn't the thought of there was no thought process because I was very new and innocent in that area.
Yeah.
It wasn't like I can't stop. It was like I want to have that feeling again. I definitely want to feel like that. And if I can feel like that most of the time, I'm in.
Interesting, because what we see, at least in our brain imaging studies, is that people that have these really, I'd say psychologically profound experiences with drugs the first time, they get that really big euphoria rush or dopamine rush. They generally tend to also be predictive of developing addictions in the future. Like, for example, many patients with alcohol addiction will say that first drink, they just remembered it and they felt complete. They felt like before that there might have been a part missing. And then after that first drink, they felt whole again. And that's because the pharmacology of these drugs and how it works on the brain really fills in any kind of psychologically negative void. It plasters over it short term. And I think it was really great that you mentioned that it doesn't last forever.
No.
And that is really where the cycle of addiction begins, is after the drugs go out of the system and you go into that withdrawal, anxiety, hungover state. What happens next is there's two pathways. And those that potentially have the resilience to understand or maybe contextualize somewhat that they don't want to do that again, they may choose not to do that drug again. But those who potentially have unfortunate life circumstances or who just really enjoy it will continue in that spiral. And so When I say genetics are important, and going back to what we said before, that predisposes you to want to take the drug, or it might predispose you to feel a certain way on your first use. But then after that, there's so many factors, as I'm sure you're aware, that will differentiate you from the next person that might be able to walk away from doing it as often.
When I fell into the modelling game, I loved it so much, and I saw an opportunity that would change my life. And that was a primary goal over any drink and drugs. But that caught up with me, obviously, at some point. But it was more like an obsession. Right, I'm going to be good at this now. Let's do this best I can and be better than everyone else, turn up, show up, work more hours. So there was a kind of an obsession which was helpful at the time.
Yeah.
But at the same token, I overworked, burnt myself out and did too much.
I wonder a lot about your industry. I've got a lot of mates who are working as well in, the modelling agents industry, and also I'm trying to get this rightly phrased in my head. We live in a land of excess, and I think maybe during the 90s in your heyday and your lifestyle, from the surface you had everything. Your life was dopamine. I mean, you can probably talk for it. How was your life from an outsider's perspective?
I always say on paper it was perfect.
Yeah.
Had the perfect relationships, perfect cars, motorbikes, watches, clothes, ability to travel and move around. And it was, that was brilliant what you just said. It was literally like dopamine. It was just a dopamine high.
One thing I think about in these worlds of modelling or fashion or TV entertainment, and also general life today, is that we have abundance all around us. Most people in the Western world don't have to worry now about food because we have availability of food at every corner shop. Junk food for sure, but it's still cheap and available. We don't have to worry about predators coming in. We have an abundance of mates, sexual partners through the rise of dating apps. And so what our reward pathways were built for was for food, survival, and reproduction. Now, most of those things in society, because of technological advancements, in the Western world at least, have been accounted for. So one theory and thinking of mine is that in an age of abundance that we have, these systems in our brains become a bit bored. They think, oh, well, I don't have to fight off a lion like our hunter-gatherer ancestors had to do to get food or forage for hours per day. I don't have to, there are sexual partners out there that I can seek. I don't have to battle with all of these males in these tribes. But because our brains are still those hunter-gatherer brains, but technology has advanced more rapidly so than our brains have been able to deal with, I think we're living in this kind of limbo period right now where our brains are like, what the fuck? There's so many rewarding opportunities around me. My basic survival is met. Therefore, these excessive things keep my brain feeling alive, like drugs are so easily accessible that people lean into them. And you can see these in towns in the north of England, for example. A lot of people have a roof over their head and they might be poor, but they may be able to eat. But they're just so bored with the quality of life that drugs are an answer to give vibrancy and colour.
I think, although there's abundance in that way, I think over the last few years, there's a mismatch of feeling like, for example, you have a phone, which is quite empowering because you can connect with anyone, like you said, when you want to. You don't have to go through a dating process. You don't have to feel that anxiety of maybe going up to someone and asking for the number, or like, do you like me, I like you, all the basic things, or going out to search for a car or whatever it is, because you just click and there's a big misengagement, which I feel so lucky that I had to go through, that was part of my life before mobile phones, and then after, to see the difference. And I can really see the difference between ordering something online or going shopping, and or even when you ask someone out. And I think if you don't learn to feel those feelings and understand the situations, what I will say as well, I think that, and there's been a lot of young male suicides in the last 4 or 5 years, that
Yeah.
even though you have that, that now doesn't work anymore, because you're right, the brain's bored, the human side, and I think the spiritual side of people are just like, what are we doing? And I feel like, although there are these things, there's a lot of desperation in lack of real connection, lack of real intimacy. And you see, you know, a lot of kids on the street on their phones and stuff, they can't talk to someone because they don't have the toolkit.
Exactly.
And that's what we're doing with Stride. We're going into schools to give talks, and we're building workshops now about how to connect and peer pressure and self-esteem.
Yeah.
And I think that personally, like money, if you come into money, all the lottery winners seem to get rid of it within a couple of years very quickly.
Yeah.
But if you work hard like you do, and you earn what you're going for, the reward for enduring all of those struggles, and, you know, especially if you're doing a PhD, I know that there's a point where everyone wants to just jump out of the window.
Yeah.
And I've seen it with my wife, and just pursuing that, there's something, I don't know in the brain if it retrains the pathways, but I think for me personally, like going for addiction and trying to retrain myself, and having those moments where you're just in despair, but going across the line and going, oh, I made that. Oh, I've achieved that. Oh, I've got over that uncomfortability. I think that in itself will rescue people.
Yeah.
Because there is abundance, but a lot of money's at the top, and there's so many people that may have a house or a car, but it's on the never, and they're, you know, they're kind of poor, but they have things.
Yeah. No, I agree. There are a lot of layers to it. I think one of the things I think we all have to be careful about in this evolving society is like things like technology. Like I'm really worried about the impact of smartphones on developing children and adolescents, and what that's doing and disconnecting us from one another. I think it was Johann Hari that said the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, the opposite of addiction is connection.
Yeah.
And I completely agree with you. We live in these more and more so detached societies, and people want to fill that detachment with a feeling of something, and that's where drugs and addictive behaviors can come in, because they give you a false sense of attachment.
I do hope, and I do feel that there's a change coming. And it may be the people I know and people I talk to, but there's a sort of change coming with our children. For example, we do tests like for the last few days we've done no TV.
Right. Okay.
And when we watch the behavior of our children, so when they watch TV for an hour, whatever they're seeing, they'll kind of be not really present in the room, and they'll kind of shuffle around and say, can I have something to eat? When they don't watch TV, they're completely different. They're like, mummy, daddy. They look you in the eye. They want to play. They get creative.
Yeah.
With gambling addiction, so you're doing a new, I've wrote this down, but it's like underneath.
Yeah, don't worry.
So you're doing new brain scans, right, with addiction and gambling. What are you actually doing, and how does that work?
Yeah, so I started this in 2019 for my PhD, and the question was, is there a brain basis to gambling addiction? Now, we know in substance use addictions like alcohol addiction, cocaine, heroin, really all the substances, that we can present a picture. It sounds very simple in neuroscience, but you can present a picture or a video of whatever the substance is to an individual, and you can see their reward circuit in their brain light up. The part of the brain that's involved in processing what's important in that environment really kind of goes full steam ahead. But we wanted to extend the question further in two ways. So the first one was, does a brain in a gambling addiction brain, does that light up in the same way when we show gambling videos to gambling addicts as it does to an alcoholic, when we show them a beer or wine or whatever drink they like? And that question was really to start figuring out if the same mechanisms involved in substance addictions are the same as behavioral addictions. So what we found was that was completely true. And we had Paul Merson come in to, you might know him, but he's an ex-Arsenal football player, ex-England football player, and he's had a very difficult time with addictions over his life as well. He had a severe gambling addiction. That's really the thing that he felt had really, gripped him the most. He'd lost £7 million of his own money over his lifetime. And as part of this documentary that we did with him, it's called Football, Gambling and Me, he explored different reasons as to why he was addicted. And one of the things that he did was come to me and our team and have his brain scanned with my tasks that I developed. And so we showed Paul's brain, and unsurprisingly, his brain versus on the videos of gambling addiction was like fire. It was his reward system in his central kind of midbrain area was so strongly lit up. His like frontal cortex as well, which is the decision-making part, also lit up. The brain was taken over. And this was just watching a video of a roulette table. This isn't even him engaging in gambling. So that showed the power of just an environmental cue in taking control of the brain. But what we also found in his brain, which was new, is that when we showed him videos of families socializing, so social cues or friends chatting or people just communicating, nature videos of like the most beautiful scenes in nature, and food as well, like, your M&S adverts of high calorie foods. Those simple rewards, nature, social connection and food, his brain did not light up to at all. It was like, I don't care.
Wow.
And we asked him after, and we've asked all of the other participants in my study now after, and we're going to release the paper soon. They said, really, it was only the gambling that got me interested. And these are participants. Paul hadn't gambled for a year. He was a year into his recovery. And he said, even now, that brain imaging really tells the truth of how I feel, that my brain has been fundamentally rewired because of my addiction. And he asked, was I born with it? Is this something that has happened over time with more and more gambling use? And the answer is both. The more that you do any behavior, the more those neural pathways cement. So it becomes a coping mechanism, a habit loop. And so when you look for that phone, that's a neural habit loop that's been entrained into you. And so with our gambling addiction research now, we really have decided and figured out that we might have this biomarker. And so the next phase of my research now is to try to understand whether psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, whether they may be able to re-normalize the addicted gambling brain, whether it can reduce some of this hyperactivation to these cues, the gambling cues, and whether it can increase an individual's ability to be able to receive and feel pleasure from natural rewards.
When I first come into sobriety, I would have to literally cover my eyes if I drove past a pub.
Wow. Well,
because I was so scared. Because there was a lot of times I'd say, I'll be home in a minute, and I'd just find myself driving into a pub and I'll just have a quick one, like an excuse. But especially with cocaine for me, that I couldn't even go into a hotel bathroom because I would smell and feel like there's cocaine in there. So it was like a euphoric recall. With the psilocybin, have you found that could that be a one-off cure, or is it kind of like a massive interruption that could reboot you, but you'd have to do other work as well?
Yeah. So kind of to go a little bit back to that kind of behavioral loops that kind of make you, let's say, do addictive behaviors. So the reason why that thrill happens when you go to the bathroom is because that's dopamine being released. Most people think dopamine is actually about pleasure, but it's not about that. It's really about motivation. And so the first time that anybody feels a reward, so for example, the first time you had cocaine, your brain will have released a lot of dopamine, probably 300 to 400% higher than normal baseline levels. And that's super physiological. And that in and of itself is so memorable because the brain is thinking, wow, that's important for my survival, because that's what that pathway, dopamine signals survival codes for the brain, for food, for sex, for reproduction. But when you take a drug like cocaine, it increases it like 3 or 4 times greater. But your brain doesn't know the difference. It just thinks, okay, great, that's for survival.
Is that the subconscious part of the brain?
That is your subconscious, that is your midbrain structures that are just constantly scanning for things that will help our survival. And so the next time, and what the brain remembers is not just the drug, but the environment in which a drug was taken. So the brain will remember the toilet and it will associate all of that thing with that high, because as far as the brain is concerned, that high is necessary for survival.
It's so important what you just said.
And therefore, that is why addiction is so hard to cull, because your brain is literally saying, I need this to survive. Addiction is a battle for survival, as I'm sure you've seen and experienced. But because biologically, you have to untrain your brain to say, actually, no, this is not survival. It's like untraining your brain to want water or food.
Yeah.
You really have to go the opposite way and really teach it that, no, sorry, I kind of fucked up, and you've been tricked into thinking that this gambling behavior, because that also releases dopamine, or cocaine or alcohol, that they are fundamental for survival. So it's unpacking that myth and the hijacking of the brain that those substances and behaviors have given, which is where we think psilocybin might work.
I'm so glad you said that. I feel like I can exhale a little bit, because I'll come back to the psilocybin, but I was always, my father still says it. And he's like, well, he must be weak-willed, or, it's just a weak-willed thing and a weak-willed thing. And I learned that early on when I come into recovery. The language was that you wasn't weak-willed, you was actually unwell. You weren't a bad person, you were just unwell.
Yeah.
And you're saying it clearly in the science terms, which is just such a relief. But what are you finding that psilocybin's doing? Obviously in the clinical
setting. Yeah. So one of the things that we've begun to figure out is really how the brain responds immediately to psilocybin. So in the brain of anyone who takes a psychedelic drug, what happens is immediately under the influence of the drug, the brain networks that control your emotions, your behaviors, your mood get completely disintegrated, and new connections form across the brain. So your brain is taken back to a very primitive hyperplastic state with increases in connections from all over the brain. So what that really means is that it disrupts the addictive thoughts for the first time in your life, potentially, or the first time in an addict's life. They might feel like they have literally escaped from that cycle of binge intoxication withdrawal.
Which would be like a massive spiritual event probably for them.
Yeah, because, in that cycle, you just kind of cycle and you go through the motions. And then what the psychedelic does quite literally is stop those brain networks maintaining the binge intoxication withdrawal network from being embodied. And the brain networks have this increase in connectivity. And we think that that increase in connectivity under psilocybin allows an individual for the very first time to start reflecting on their addictive thought cycles. They might, for the first time, be able to take a step back from themselves and think, why is it that I've been thinking about having a drink? What are the precursors to those thought patterns? It takes an individual outside of the habit loops they're in and allows them to reflect inwards. What it also, we think, really allows an individual to do is to revisit past trauma. So the unconscious mind is a part of the brain where we think a lot of material is held related to why we are the way we are. And our brains are very good at hiding that from us in a sober brain state.
To keep us safe.
To keep us safe. Yeah. It's a compensatory adaptive mechanism to allow us to survive. But when we take a psychedelic, because our brains are unlocked, and we have this increase in connectivity, we might recall memories related to childhood trauma. And we might be able to actively, for the first time, engage with very deep emotional feelings that have never been processed. So the two mechanisms that we think it works by are by basically shunting the addiction repetitive thought cycles, allowing an individual to step back and look at their behaviors. And secondly, allowing an individual to confront any kind of past behaviors or traumas that they think might be leading or contributing to their addiction. But what we haven't figured out yet, and what my study is going to try to understand, is how much the brain changes out of an addictive brain state to a more healthier brain state in the long term. So what we'll be doing with our patients, we've got two groups, one group with gambling addiction and one with heroin addiction. And we're going to be scanning their brains beforehand to see what their brain states are like. We're going to look at these networks to see how rigid they are. For example, we're going to look at cue reactivity to see how much their brains light up to the drug. So we'll show them heroin clips or gambling clips, and then we'll scan their brains a week after and 3 months after psilocybin therapy. So just one dose. And what we think is going to happen is that real emergence, that spiritual and brain and mind awakening will allow the individual with some therapy, CBT and other therapies in months after, to really start unraveling why they became an addict and how to escape it and live a life of sobriety potentially, which is an aim, but a life where they're able to control their addictive behaviors better.
That's incredible. How would something like that work on me being 21 years in? Because I definitely believe I've rewired myself to a certain extent, but some things, some triggers, not that I ever want to drink or anything, but there's been a couple of times where I felt so pressured that I'm like, I know what would take that away, even though I'm not big gone there. And it really sort of wears me down over a couple of days. So I feel like I get an emotional hangover from fighting something sometimes.
Well, what we're looking at really is for people who are kind of acutely going through kind of severe addiction problems. So it's in order to initiate remission.
Yeah.
But what we haven't done yet is looking at how in remission it can prolong abstinence. And that is a really interesting part of research that we're still to do. But my guess is that it will only help to unpick and unravel some of the adaptive skills you've used. It might reinforce them potentially. Now, the critical thing here is that it's not just the drug alone. So the drug allows the brain to enter this very hyperplastic sort of state, but it's with really trained expert guides and therapists that when the brain is in this really malleable state and those addiction entrenched thought patterns have been kind of melted away, that we can remold the brain into more adaptive ways of being through therapy. So, I mean, I don't encourage anyone to ever do this without trained therapists or in legal settings. But if you were to do it in those settings, I think what it may be able to do is to help you consolidate some of the skills that I have to say it's fantastic that you've been able to do it. I honestly commend anyone that's been able to go into sobriety without something like a psychedelic, because psychedelics really just make it a lot easier. It just allows, well, that's what we think, it just allows you to enter that state of change as possible more quicker.
So just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting that I was going to do psilocybin, because I know people that do microdose, not in this country, but I feel that they've changed their addiction just to microdosing, and there's no therapy involved. And I think it's very important. I think it's very, very important that these are done under clinical situations and they're done for a purpose in that way. Yeah,
I think what these drugs help you to do is to really see the world and your place in it with a more clear lens. I mean, one of the other things to note is that the research coming out now, the clinical data, not just the brain imaging data from psychedelics for addiction, is some of the best we've ever seen in all of medicine. So about 75% of people with alcohol addiction improve after one single dose of LSD. So unlike what the microdosing stuff that you spoke about and that approach, we're really looking at one or two really big therapy doses, and then that really be the treatment, not like returning for more after that. We think 2 to 3 might be sufficient. But yeah, about 75% of people after a single dose of LSD improve from alcohol addiction. When you compare patients with alcohol addiction that had a placebo therapy versus psilocybin therapy, those in the psilocybin therapy, 9 months later, 9% of them were heavily drinking versus 25% in the placebo group. Wow. So it's about 2.5 times more effective than talking therapy alone, psilocybin. In smoking addiction, 80% of participants that were given psilocybin therapy were abstinent at 6 months, and then a further 60% at 2 years. You just don't get these results with current treatments, talking therapies. I predict it's going to be about 2 to 3 times more effective than anything we've currently got on the market.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? Because these things have been used for years and years, thousands of years in other cultures. In life, we miss this. This is just my personal view. We miss a spiritual element, which I really believe we have. We've used it for all our language for thousands of years. I believe we have, and that's probably one of the most things that's being ignored. And if you feel spiritually well, and what I mean by that is when you see someone who's in their addiction, their eyes are pretty much dead, and they're not there. Where you look at a young child or a horse or a dog or an animal, and they're spirited and they're with you and they're completely there. That's the bit I feel that if that was looked after, which is probably what your guys are doing, then people kind of come away and go, oh, what am I doing? Why have I been thinking that way?
Interesting. That's really interesting. You talk about spirituality. It's something I really have begun to care a lot about. I was recently in Mexico with some shamans in January, doing an experience for myself there. And I really wanted to understand the importance of spirituality in this medicine. And I've been thinking a lot about spirituality from my family, my grandma, who's an Indian Hindu old lady, and she has lots of these spiritual practices, and a lot of her friends do. And I look at them and I think they're so content with life. And they just, they have their daily routines of prayer to a higher power and these rituals. And it got me thinking about the power of ritual and how in Western contemporary societies, I think we have the spiritual crisis. There's like a rejection of religion. There's a rejection of collectivism. And I think, we always look for society. As scientists, we look at 3 things. It's like biological factors that make someone ill, psychological and social factors. And all of those 3 will predict how an individual in that society may or may not turn out. But I think we now have to look at biological, psychological, social and spiritual factors. And what drugs like psychedelics do is they change your biology, because we know that they increase neuroplasticity to change your brain. They change your psychology through unlocking the brain to reveal the mind. They can change society because, as you said, it changes your view of what's important in the world. But most importantly, it allows you to reconnect with this highest sense of self or power, a connection to yourself, a connection to others and to nature. And so because I think it works in all those 4 pathways, this is a whole new paradigm shift of thinking about mental well-being and addiction.
I totally agree. So I find it really interesting, this subject, because my father's a very good atheist and agnostic.
Okay.
And I ask my mum about stuff, and she always talks about spirit and other things in a good way, not a religion. And I think what I've learned going through a 12-step program is that they say that if you fix the spirit, because it's a spiritual disease, that the brain will straighten out and the body will straighten out after. So the point, what I learned, that abstinence gives you the opportunity to have clarity. And then there's a certain process that you go through, the work of brilliant questions that you basically get to see the way you've been thinking. What is the reality of your thinking? What is the addictive thinking? Whatever resentments or fears you've had. So you clear out everything, which is amazing. And then you have the support of a collective group that's not religious. And what's really good is about it is it doesn't matter if you're rich, poor, where you're from, what demographic. It has no thing. But the spiritual journey in it is the thing that binds everybody together and takes away any judgment of anything. It's really, really powerful. And I went, I've done lots of different spiritual practices, and probably sometimes too much. I got a little bit lost in them.
Which ones have you done?
Well, we did when I lived in LA, I did a certain type of yoga,
Okay.
for a year and a half, and we would do sometimes like 8 hours of like these deep meditation, chanting, breathing
Oh, right.
stuff.
Okay.
So like probably too much.
Yeah.
But also it was interesting because there's different ways apparently of finding spirituality, and some of them are like in qigong and tai chi is to bust your ego down through hard work and etc. And then I practiced tai chi in LA for quite some time. So I'm really interested in that spiritual side because I feel that that's been mischaracterized as well as woo-woo and people that just sit there burning candles and stuff like that. And it's not. It's actually quite a disciplined thing. But for me, it's allowed me to have a sort of higher plane of thinking and a higher view about stuff.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm not in my addiction. I feel like I'm sort of above it and I can see it. I still think it's there. I still think those pathways are there, and I may be completely wrong.
Yeah.
Because I can feel them sometimes, or I can feel when I get excited sometimes.
Yeah.
But I feel like this overriding spirituality helps guide everything.
And it's protecting you from the rises and falls of your desires, or
and you can feel them. And sometimes I've been close to the mark early on in sobriety. I really have.
It's this state of transcendence that I feel is where the solution to addiction lies. It's higher than self is the ultimate goal, I believe, from like AA. And I know that you've maybe have read about Bill Wilson and some of his earlier inspirations for the AA, and he had his own journeys with some hallucinogenic drugs, and then LSD, and he managed.
He was quite depressed, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, he was a drinker. He was mainly, a really, prolific alcoholic in the 1930s, and in 1934 he went to New York State Hospital Department on his fourth attempt to quit drinking, and they gave him this mixture of plants called deliriants. One was called scopolamine, and the other one was called belladonna. And they gave them this drink, and after taking this drink, he said that he saw this bright white light appear, and he felt like he'd transcended his body into the ether, essentially. And after that point, he said he felt like he'd seen a vision of a life without alcohol. And as he convinced others to do this research with LSD, and he also developed separately the AA amongst other people, this higher power spirituality appears to me to be a mechanism of getting there. And you can do Tai Chi to get there. You can do yoga. You can do many spiritual practices. And I think psychedelics are also one of those where you can reach those states of just connecting to something bigger than self. So I think they all share a similar mechanism. There's this organization that exists called Psychedelics in Recovery, and they're a group of individuals who have used psychedelics who also ascribe by the AA principles, but because the AA doesn't conscribe to substance use, it's kind of a bit of a faction that have found it useful. And we've worked a bit with them and spoken a lot with people who are recovering under their infrastructure. And the same things that you're saying about spirituality and stuff always come up all the time, and perhaps that's the answer.
Honestly, I hope all this stuff's made legal. Are you quite restricted in what you can do at the moment?
Yeah, so, well, the war on drugs, for a start, is a fucking joke.
I know, yeah.
Like, between 2011 and this year, we have 10 times more cocaine deaths. We have 3 times more opiate deaths. We've got the highest level of novel psychoactive substances like fentanyl, killing 120,000 people in the US alone every single year. The war on drugs in 1971 was meant to stop this. Every indicator of success of banning drugs to help prevent harm has failed, miserably failed. We're getting worse year on year. Psychedelics were put into class Schedule 1, heavily restricted research. The hope is psilocybin in the next 2 to 3 years will be legalized or for medical use in depression first. And then we hope our trials in addiction will allow it to be marketed within the NHS maybe 5 years from now, is probably a good guess. But then when it gets medicalized, then we can start thinking about legalization. Because I think the biggest thing right now is that we think that there can be the best innovations in mental health and addiction. So we've got to get it to patients first.
Yeah.
I was looking on your website yesterday, Stride, just to figure out a bit more about what you do. And I saw one stat that was basically saying for every £1 invested in addiction treatment, you get £3 back to society. And that was a stat from Public Health England. And I digged into it a bit more, and it's true. Like, if we invest in these new treatments, which are going to change the current level of treatment provision, only 7 people in 100 who are treated with mental health or addiction actually get effective treatment. 7% of people have effective treatment. It's a joke. If we can move the needle to 40%, imagine what that does to society broadly. People are back in work. Families are no longer broken. Individuals are able to contribute. And if these drugs, which are prohibited right now, are one of the solutions to that, it doesn't make sense to me that they should be kept in this prohibited class.
Yeah.
We have to think differently, because clearly what we've done so far has only made things worse. Now, I'm never going to be able to say right now that things like psychedelics are things that you should take, because they have not gone through clinical trials. But there are clinical trials open and available where psilocybin therapy is given. So in my trials, for example, I'm working with the NHS's Specialist National Problem Gambling Clinic, and we'll be recruiting patients from that to take part in these studies, and also the opiate studies. So many trials around the world going on. And so if you do feel inclined, you can go on clinicaltrials.gov, find out whether you're eligible, and that might be a route to taking part in a clinical study, because that could also potentially be helpful.
Really good to know. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been
Brilliant.
great.
Thank you. Okay. That was amazing. I could talk to you for months. This is Powerful is brought to you by Stride Foundation. If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, please head over to www.stridefoundation.com, where you can find links to resources that may help. You can also donate. Please make a donation. It will help us bring to you more episodes. Please rate, follow, and subscribe to the show. Why? This will help the algorithm make us more visible to others who need help. And share this podcast with your family, friends. Head over to social media at Paul Scolfort and at this_is_powerful. You'll get to see what's coming up, and you can get in touch with us, because I love hearing about you. Thank you also to my beautiful wife, Dr. Federica Amati, the best producer, Shannon Delrich, to Ever Long, who does all the hard work in the background. Thank you also to Julia Cicolella, Rayyan Musa, and the rest of the team. Hi everybody, I'd really love to hear your views so that we can produce a podcast with the content that matters to you. It doesn't matter if you just joined us or if you've been listening from the start. We would love you to fill in the short listener feedback form, which you can find in the show notes. And let me know your thoughts on our podcast. It would really mean a lot. Thanks, guys.